the 3rd of October 1942, Usedom Island, Baltic coast. At Test Stand 7 in Peenemünde, the wind tastes of salt and solvent. Technicians in oil-blackened overalls step back from a needle-slender shape crouched on its launch table, an A-4 rocket, the machine the world will later know as the V2. A siren blares, an ignition spark licks, and then the night is torn open. The rocket rises on a pillar of white fire, animals bolt for the tree line, and even the senior officers, men who have watched 1,000 explosions, forget to breathe. For a few exultant seconds, a silver spear drills into the clouds and keeps going. Someone says it softly, as if afraid to scare the future away. It works. Word travels quickly. In Berlin, reports pile up on polished mahogany. Successful flight, telemetry received, guidance acceptable, the ceiling higher than anything mankind has yet achieved. Within days, the language around the project changes. Where engineers wrote of prototypes and iterations, politicians begin saying Wunderwaffe, a miracle weapon. And under the Reich Chancellery's bunker lights, a familiar idea hardens into dogma. Technology will redeem strategy. It will outpace the enemy's numbers, their factories, their alliances. It will erase mistakes. Across the Reich, other machines are gestating. In Augsburg, the Messerschmitt Me 262, sleek twin-engined, faster than any propeller-driven fighter in the sky, howls down a runway, leaving test pilots laughing out loud inside their masks. In the pine forests, assembly halls are blasted into hillsides, conveyor belts hunched underground like arteries. In briefing rooms, new acronyms and code names flutter like moths against green felt maps. V1, V2, Amerika Bomber, Maus. Each carries a promise with the gloss of inevitability. The Allies will meet something they have never seen, and all their arithmetic will fail. But promises have costs. Alcohol and liquid oxygen by the railcar, nickel, chromium, high-temperature alloys metals that also feed the cannons and engines already fighting. Skilled workers, diverted from tanks. Scientists who measure progress in months, not days. Even here, at the edge of the Baltic, you can feel the contradiction humming beneath the triumph. The Reich is running out of time, and miracle weapons demand time most of all. Still, the dream blooms. In late-night conferences, silhouettes lean over blueprints under swinging lamps. If the Me 262 flew in squadron strength a year earlier, if the Von 2nd and V2 seconds struck not by the hundreds but the thousands, might the air war tilt back? Might London tremble? Might Allied bombers break? Might history itself shift a few degrees? The cameras of the propaganda ministry find the angles: stainless steel, gloved hands, a plume of flame at liftoff. And for a moment, looking at those frames, even a skeptic can believe in salvation by speed and fire. This is the story of how close Germany came to a technology that looked like the future and why the future arrived too late. The 13th of June 1944. In London, sirens wailed again, a sound the city had almost learned to live with. For nearly 5 years, residents had endured the Luftwaffe's blitz, then the intermittent drone of high-altitude bombers. But what they heard that morning was different. It began as a thin, mechanical buzzing, as if some monstrous insect were hovering overhead. Londoners looked up, searching for the familiar silhouette of a bomber, but saw instead a stubby, winged cylinder, trailing fire from a crude exhaust pipe. It was small, too small to carry a pilot, and it did not seem to maneuver. It simply thundered in a straight line. And then the engine cut. Silence for 2 long seconds. Then, impact. A block in East London vanished in flame and dust. This was the V1 flying bomb, the world's first mass-produced cruise missile. Newspapers at first called it the buzz bomb or doodlebug, after the sinister sound it made. But its official German designation was Vergeltungswaffe, retaliation weapon. Within weeks, more than 2,000 of these pilotless bombs would scream across the channel, their guidance crude, their accuracy limited, but their effect undeniable. Fear. In the pubs and shelters, a new ritual spread. If the buzzing overhead stopped, you ran. If it kept going, you breathed again. London, already scarred, was forced to live with yet another species of terror. The Allied leadership was shaken. Winston Churchill admitted privately that the V1 campaign was serious and damaging. In the House of Commons, ministers fielded desperate questions. Could this weapon be stopped? Would thousands more come? In the War Cabinet minutes, one can read the anxiety of men who had believed air superiority was already secured. Suddenly, German weapons seemed to leapfrog the present, but the V-1 was only a prelude. In September 1944, the first V-2 rockets struck London and Antwerp. Unlike the V-1, these weapons arrived without warning. No buzzing, no engine drone. One moment the street was ordinary, the next, a building imploded in a thunderclap from nowhere. Travelling faster than the speed of sound, the V-2 gave no chance to intercept. Its range 200 miles, its payload nearly a ton of high explosive. To civilians on the ground, it felt like the laws of war had changed overnight. Imagine the psychological shock. A city that had grown used to radar alerts, to scrambling fighters, to anti-aircraft guns, now faced a threat it could not predict or prevent. Diaries from Londoners speak of a different kind of dread. "We no longer look up," one woman wrote. "We simply wait." For the Allies, this was the moment of realization. The Third Reich had crossed into weapons that belonged more to the Cold War than the Second World War. The Germans were building technology that could leap beyond trenches and tanks, beyond the familiar tempo of war. And if they had begun sooner, if Hitler had not delayed the Me-262, if the V-2 had entered service in 1943, what then? In Berlin, Hitler grasped at these weapons like a drowning man reaching for driftwood. To his generals, he declared that retaliation weapons would force Britain to its knees, shatter morale, and perhaps fracture the Allied alliance. Propaganda broadcasts trumpeted them as proof of German genius, as a glimpse of invincibility still to come. The word Wunderwaffe, miracle weapon, entered the public lexicon. Yet behind the rhetoric, the cracks were already visible. The V-1 could be intercepted by faster fighters like the Spitfire Moker 14th, or shot down by improved anti-aircraft guns. The V-2, though unstoppable, was monstrously expensive. Tens of thousands of labourers, including prisoners from Mittelbau Dora, were consumed in its underground production. Each rocket that slammed into London had cost the Reich far more than the damage it inflicted. Still, in the summer and autumn of 1944, the shock was real. For ordinary soldiers and civilians alike, the idea that Germany possessed future weapons was unsettling. Allied intelligence scrambled for answers, dispatching agents to track launch sites, intercept blueprints, interrogate captured engineers. Fear mixed with fascination. Could this be the dawn of a new kind of war? And in that moment of doubt, the legend of the Wunderwaffe took root. For the German people, exhausted by endless defeats, it became a final candle of hope. Somewhere in the shadows, their scientists were preparing salvation. For the Allies, it was the seed of a different question. What if Hitler had been just a little faster? In the summer of 1942, deep inside Bavaria, the Messerschmitt Company rolled out a prototype that looked nothing like the stubby, prop-driven fighters that had filled European skies. The Me-262 was sleek, with swept wings and twin nacelles hanging like clenched fists beneath them. Its Jumo 004 turbojet screamed rather than roared, and its airspeed touched 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles faster than the best Allied fighters of the day. Test pilots wrote in their logs that it felt like flying into the future. On paper, it was a war winner. With 4 30mm cannons mounted in its nose, the Me-262 could shred a bomber formation in seconds. American airmen who later encountered it admitted that no piston-engine fighter could match its acceleration. One Luftwaffe ace, Adolf Galland, said bluntly, "It was like a storm breaking in the clear sky." But history is cruel to prototypes. The Reich's industry in 1942 was already straining under the weight of Allied bombing and the demands of the Eastern Front. Jet engines devoured high-temperature alloys that were also needed for tanks and submarines. Worse, Hitler interfered directly. Obsessed with offense, he ordered the Me-262 redesigned as a blitz bomber capable of carrying bombs against ground targets. The delay was fatal. By the time the jet entered combat in mid-1944, the skies over Germany were already crawling with hundreds of Mustangs and Thunderbolts, ready to hunt anything that took off. Only about 1,400 Me-262 seconds were built, and fewer than 300 ever saw combat. Pilots who flew them scored victories, yes, but fuel shortages meant they could rarely fly. New recruits needed months of training to master a jet, and the Reich no longer had months. What might have been a revolution became a footnote. And yet, the what-if lingers. Allied commanders admitted privately that if squadrons of Me-260 2 had been available in 1943, the combined bomber offensive might have ground to a halt. The American daylight raid, so costly already, could have become impossible. Germany's cities might have survived longer, its industry less shattered. Perhaps even the timing of D-Day itself would have shifted. Instead, the Me-262 became a symbol not of salvation but of desperation. The jet that showed what was possible but arrived when nothing was possible anymore. The buzzing terror of the V-1. By the summer of 1944, Londoners had grown familiar with the sound of sirens, the rush into shelters, the thunder of bombs. But the V-1 flying bomb was different. Witnesses remembered it as a sound you could feel in your teeth, a harsh, stuttering buzz that gave the weapon its nickname, the buzz bomb or doodlebug. The contraption itself was crude, a small pilotless aircraft with stubby wings, a pulse jet engine, and a warhead packed with nearly a ton of explosives. Its range was about 150 miles, just enough to leap across the English Channel. Launched from ramps along the French coast, the WWII followed a simple course. They flew low, at roughly 350 miles per hour, until the fuel ran out. Then the engine cut off, and silence descended. Londoners quickly learned that silence was the deadliest sound of all. After 10 or 15 seconds, the missile plunged straight down and detonated with devastating force. In its first week, more than 500 volts 1 second were launched against London. By the campaign's end, over 9,000 had been fired at Britain. Roughly 2,400 landed in the city, killing more than 6,000 people and injuring 3 times that number. The psychological toll was immense. Diaries describe children crying themselves to sleep, mothers listening for the buzz above the rooftops, whole neighborhoods shattered in seconds. Yet the V-1 also exposed the contradictions of the Wunderwaffe. It was terrifying, yes, but not decisive. British defences adapted quickly. Radar stations tracked launches. Anti-aircraft batteries were moved closer to the coast, firing shells equipped with newly developed proximity fuses. Most importantly, new fighter aircraft, especially the fast Spitfire Manka 14th and the Tempest 5, were dispatched to hunt the WWII in mid-air. Pilots developed a risky but effective technique, flying alongside the doodlebug, slipping a wingtip beneath its stubby wing, and flipping it over. Disoriented, the missile crashed harmlessly into fields or the sea. By August 1944, interception rates rose dramatically, and nearly half of all WWII were being destroyed before reaching their targets. From the German perspective, the V-1 was a weapon of economy. It was cheap, far cheaper than a bomber and pilot, and could be produced in the thousands. It required no training crews, no fuel for return flights. It was, in theory, the ideal tool for exhausting the enemy's morale. But in practice, its crude guidance system meant that entire missiles could miss London by miles, crashing into empty countryside. Each V-1 that struck a house or school made headlines, but as a strategic weapon it failed to halt Allied advances. Still, for Hitler and his propaganda machine, the V-1 was gold. Newsreels showed the sleek little bomb roaring skyward. Posters promised vengeance. In speeches, Goebbels insisted that Britain would soon face waves of unstoppable weapons. For the German public, battered by bombing and battlefield defeats, the idea of a miracle weapon was a comfort, even if it was an illusion. For the Allies, the V-1 raised darker questions. If Germany could mass-produce pilotless bombs, what came next? Intelligence reports spoke of larger designs, longer ranges. Some feared that New York itself might be in danger if the Reich developed an intercontinental version. Engineers at Peenemünde had indeed sketched such projects, though they never left the drawing board. In the end, the V-1 was a paradox, a weapon that changed the psychology of war more than the outcome. It introduced the world to the age of the cruise missile, but too late, too clumsily, and against an enemy too resilient to be broken by fear alone. For Londoners, it was another ordeal in a long litany of trials. For Germany, it was another desperate gamble. And hovering behind it, already in production, was something far more advanced, the rocket that would fall silently, faster than sound, and carry with it the first true shadow of the space age, the silent thunder of the V-2. On the morning of the 8th of September 1944, residents of London's Chiswick district heard nothing unusual. There was no siren, no drone of engines, no buzzing in the sky. At 6:43 a.m., without warning, a house disintegrated in an explosion so violent that it rattled windows a mile away. 6 people died instantly. Investigators at first thought it must have been a gas main accident, but as similar blasts followed in London and Antwerp, the truth emerged. Germany had unleashed a weapon the world had never seen, the V2 rocket. The V2 was a leap into the future. Over 14 meters tall, powered by liquid oxygen and ethanol, it could reach speeds of 3,500 miles per hour, faster than the speed of sound. Its parabolic arc carried it more than 50 miles into the edge of space before it plunged back down to Earth. It struck with the force of nearly a ton of high explosive. And because it traveled faster than sound, the explosion came first, the roar of arrival only afterward. There was no defense, no radar warning, no fighters to intercept it, no anti-aircraft shells fast enough to catch it. For civilians, the V2 redefined terror, death from nowhere. Technologically, it was decades ahead of its time. Designed by Wernher von Braun and his team at Peenemünde, the rocket incorporated guidance gyroscopes, turbopumps, and aerodynamic controls that would later become standard in spaceflight. Allied scientists who studied fragments of crashed rockets realized they were looking not at a weapon of the present war, but at the foundations of the next. Yet the Wunderwaffe paradox appeared again. Each V2 cost an astronomical sum to build, equivalent to dozens of fighter planes. The Reich produced over 3,000, at enormous expense, using forced laborers in the hellish underground tunnels of Mittelbau Dora, where tens of thousands of prisoners died from starvation, disease, and beatings. For every civilian killed by a V2 strike, it is estimated that more people perished constructing the rockets. Militarily, the V2 accomplished little. Roughly 1,400 were launched at London and 1,600 at Antwerp, killing around 9,000 civilians in total. The destruction was horrific for those directly struck: a cinema obliterated, a crowded market erased, but as a percentage of overall wartime casualties, the numbers were small. Compared to the tens of thousands of tons of bombs dropped daily by the Allies on German cities, the V2 was a pinprick, but psychologically it mattered. Diaries from Antwerp describe a city living in constant dread, knowing that no warning was possible. In London, one survivor wrote, "At least with the Blitz you heard them coming. This is like fate itself, falling from the sky." Churchill called them the most cruel weapons ever devised. For Hitler, the V2 was both obsession and delusion. He insisted it would force Britain to sue for peace, or at least paralyze Allied logistics through terror. But the launches did not slow the Allied advance through France and the Low Countries. If anything, they hardened resolve. British intelligence devised elaborate operations to track launch sites, bombing mobile ramps and supply depots, though never quickly enough to prevent attacks entirely. Ironically, the greatest legacy of the V2 was not in the war it failed to win, but in the peace that followed. At war's end, both the United States and the Soviet Union scrambled to capture German rocket scientists and hardware. Von Braun and many of his colleagues surrendered to the Americans, eventually designing the Saturn V rocket that would send astronauts to the moon. The V2, born in the desperation of Hitler's Reich, became the ancestor of space exploration. But in 1944, that future was invisible to the civilians huddled in London and Antwerp, who only knew that the laws of warfare had changed. The soundless thunder of the V2 was proof that the Third Reich could still reach across the Channel, even as its armies retreated on every front. And once again the Allies asked themselves, what if this weapon had arrived sooner, in greater numbers? Would the war's outcome have shifted, or was it already too late for miracles? The colossal dreams that sank in steel. If the Me-262 and the V-weapon seemed like glimpses of the future, other projects in Hitler's Wunderwaffe portfolio looked more like fever dreams, immense machines designed to impress, but doomed by their very scale. One of the most extraordinary was the Panzer VIII Maus, the heaviest tank ever built. Conceived by Ferdinand Porsche and approved by Hitler himself, the Maus weighed nearly 190 tons. Its armor was up to 240 millimeters thick, its main gun a massive 128 millimeters cannon capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges over 2 kilometers. On paper, it was an indestructible land battleship. In practice, it was useless. The Maus was so heavy it could barely move across bridges, requiring custom pontoons or engineering feats just to cross rivers. Its fuel consumption was astronomical at a time when Germany scarcely had enough petrol for trucks. Only 2 prototypes were built, both too slow and cumbersome to see combat. Soviet troops captured them in 1945, marveling at the size but shaking their heads at the absurdity. Then there was the Schwerer Gustav, better known as the Dora gun, a railway cannon of almost mythical proportions. Built by Krupp, it weighed 1,350 tons, fired shells nearly 8 meters long, and could lob a 7-ton projectile 30 miles. Used in the siege of Sevastopol in 1942, Dora reduced fortifications to rubble. But moving it required 25 trains, 4,000 men, and weeks of preparation. Against a mobile enemy like the Allies in 1944, it was already obsolete. By the time the Western Front came under pressure, Dora was useless, a symbol of gigantomania that consumed resources better spent on aircraft or U-boats. And still the fantasies continued. Engineers drafted plans for the Amerika Bomber, a strategic aircraft capable of crossing the Atlantic to strike New York. Designs from Messerschmitt and Junkers proposed 4- and 6-engine monsters with ranges exceeding 6,000 miles. Some concepts even imagined a rocket-powered skip glider that would arc into suborbital space before diving onto US targets. None progressed beyond prototypes. Germany had neither the materials nor the production capacity to build a true intercontinental bomber, and by 1943 the skies over Europe belonged to Allied fighters. Other projects veered further into the bizarre. The Land Cruiser P. 1000 Ratti, a 1,000-ton supertank armed with naval guns, existed only on blueprints before being cancelled as impractical. Jet-powered flying wings like the Horton Ho 229 promised stealth-like characteristics, but never advanced beyond a handful of prototypes. Each project consumed the time of skilled engineers and factories already starved of labor and materials. What united these colossal weapons was not effectiveness but symbolism. Hitler was entranced by size, by spectacle, by machines that embodied dominance. To him, a tank like the Maus or a gun like Dora was proof that the Reich could still outbuild and outmatch its enemies. But while Germany invested in super-heavy prototypes, the Allies invested in scale. American factories churned out 50,000 Sherman tanks, 18,000 B-24 bombers, and millions of rifles. Soviet assembly lines delivered tens of thousands of rugged T-34 seconds that swarmed the Eastern Front. Against such numbers, a handful of superweapons were irrelevant. Even among German officers there was cynicism. General Heinz Guderian dismissed the Maus as an absurd idea. Engineers whispered that Dora was a vanity project. But dissent was dangerous, and so the projects limped along until they were crushed by reality. In retrospect, these Wunderwaffe were less about winning the war than about postponing the admission of defeat. They gave Hitler talking points, propaganda reels, and brief illusions of power. For the German public, they served as promises, just wait, the miracle is coming. For the Allies, they were puzzles to be studied, but rarely threats to be feared. By 1945, most lay in ruins. Half-finished prototypes abandoned in forests, giant blueprints gathering dust in underground vaults. They were monuments not to genius but to desperation, a reminder that in modern war, spectacle without strategy is only another road to defeat. Scientists, slaves, and the price of miracles. Behind every Wunderwaffe project stood not only visionary engineers, but also a darker foundation, tens of thousands of coerced laborers who paid for these miracle weapons with their lives. At the center of it all was Werner von Braun, a brilliant young engineer who dreamed of space exploration. In his notebooks, he sketched rockets that could carry satellites, probes, even men beyond Earth's atmosphere. But in the crucible of war, those dreams were bent into weapons. Von Braun's team at Peenemünde designed the V-2 rocket with breathtaking ingenuity, but under the gaze of Heinrich Himmler and the SS, their laboratory became entangled with terror. When Allied bombers struck Peenemünde in 1943, production was moved underground to the Mittelwerk tunnels near Nordhausen. There, a vast subterranean factory was carved out of the Harz Mountains, worked not by volunteers but by prisoners dragged from concentration camps. In the damp, choking darkness, men and women built the future of rocketry under the whip. Survivors described the tunnels as hell on earth. Shifts lasting 12 to 18 hours, no sunlight, food so scarce that workers gnawed on scraps of wood or leather. Disease spread unchecked. Guards executed prisoners for the smallest infractions. The statistics are staggering. Of the roughly 60,000 laborers forced into Mittelwerk, at least 20,000 died, more than twice the number of civilians killed by V-2 attacks on Britain. In the calculus of the Reich, human life was cheaper than steel. Elsewhere, other Wunderwaffe projects drew on similar exploitation. The construction of launch ramps, the assembly of Me-262 jets, even the massive Dora railway gun, all relied on prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates. While propaganda reels showed gleaming weapons rising from hidden facilities, the reality was mud, hunger, and death beneath the ground. And still, Hitler's faith in miracle weapons only deepened. He bullied generals who doubted him, declaring that the Allies would soon face the storm of vengeance. Ministers like Albert Speer, the Reich armaments chief, tried to manage the contradictions. In his memoirs, Speer admitted he knew the Wunderwaffe could not reverse Germany's defeat. Yet he pressed production anyway, partly to appease Hitler, partly to keep scientists out of Allied hands, and partly because even illusions of hope kept the German public docile. For ordinary citizens, rumors of secret weapons became lifelines. Leaflets and radio broadcasts hinted that a turning point was imminent. Housewives whispered that the Führer was holding back a weapon so powerful it would wipe away the enemy. Newspapers printed sketches of rockets piercing the clouds, tanks as tall as houses. In truth, most of these weapons existed only as prototypes fed by blood. And what of the scientists? Some, like von Braun, later claimed they had no choice, that they served under duress. Others admitted ambition played its role. The chance to pursue advanced research, to be at the forefront of technology, was irresistible even if it meant complicity in crimes. After the war, many of them would be swept into Operation Paperclip, transported to the United States to build rockets for the Cold War, and, eventually, the moon landing. In the Soviet zone, engineers were captured and set to work on Moscow's missile programs. Thus, the legacy of the Wunderwaffe is not only technological but moral. The same rockets that terrorized London laid the groundwork for space exploration. The same engineers who worked under Himmler's eye became heroes of the space race. The same tunnels where prisoners died in darkness became historical scars, silent reminders that progress can emerge from atrocity. By 1944, Germany's dream of miracle weapons was no longer about winning. It was about denial, about clinging to the idea that genius and steel could substitute for dwindling armies and collapsing fronts. In the end, the Wunderwaffe were monuments to contradiction, brilliance and brutality, innovation and inhumanity, all welded together in the twilight of a dying Reich. Jet shadows over the Reich. By the autumn of 1944, the skies over Germany had become a battlefield of numbers. Hundreds of American B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds droned in formation, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs. Against this ocean of silver, the Luftwaffe could offer only dwindling squadrons of worn-out fighters and exhausted pilots. And yet, when the Me-262 finally entered combat, it was as if a ghost from the future had slipped into the war. Allied pilots who first encountered it could hardly believe their eyes. The jet screamed past at speeds their Mustangs could never reach, closing in on bombers so quickly that gunners had only seconds to fire. Its 30mm cannons spat shells that could tear apart a flying fortress with a single hit. On the 26th of September 1944, in one of its first operational missions, a formation of Me-262 seconds downed several American bombers in minutes, leaving survivors stunned by the sheer speed of the attack. There was a moment, just a moment, when it seemed the tide might shift. If the Luftwaffe could field hundreds of jets, the bombing campaign might become untenable. Even General James Doolittle admitted the Me-262 was a formidable adversary. American pilots whispered in debriefings that they had glimpsed the weapon of tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. The jets were too few, too late. Fuel shortages grounded many. Allied bombing raids targeted runways and maintenance depots, catching Me-262 seconds vulnerable as they taxied or landed. Pilots, some barely trained, struggled to master the temperamental engines, which flamed out or seized under stress. And every hour spent repairing jets was an hour not spent defending against the endless waves of Allied aircraft. The Me-262 did score victories. Nearly 500 Allied planes were claimed, destroyed by jet units, but against the scale of the combined bomber offensive, these were drops in a vast storm. The Allies lost thousands of bombers and fighters overall, yet replacement squadrons kept arriving. Germany, by contrast, could not replace what it lost. For the pilots who flew it, the Me-262 was both exhilaration and despair. Veteran ace Adolf Galland later recalled that flying the jet was like being a king for a moment, but even he admitted it was a king ruling over ashes. Each sortie was a glimpse of what might have been a Reich that had prepared earlier, a Luftwaffe reborn in jet-age armor, but in reality it was only the last gasp of a dying air force. The miracle weapon had appeared. It had terrified, impressed, even killed, but it had not saved. Cities that waited for silence. London, autumn 1944. The air raid sirens no longer promised safety, because the new terror came without warning. First had been the V1 buzz bombs, their insect-like drone filling streets with dread. Londoners had learned to measure life in seconds the moment the sound stopped. You had only heartbeats before impact. Then came the V2, a weapon that erased even that grim comfort. No sound, no alarm. One moment a marketplace bustled with shoppers, the next it was a crater of fire and smoke. Between September 1944 and March 1945, nearly 10,000 volts, 1 second and over 1,400 volts, 2 seconds were launched at Britain. Antwerp, newly liberated by the Allies, endured another 1,600 volts, 2 strikes. The numbers are cold, but the stories are searing. On the 25th of November 1944, a single V2 hit a crowded Woolworths department store in London, killing 168 civilians. In Antwerp, a V2 struck the Rex Cinema, slaughtering 567 people, the deadliest single rocket attack of the war. The terror was not only in the destruction, but in the waiting. Londoners went about their days with a new fatalism. One diarist wrote, "It may come, or it may not. There is nothing to do but continue drinking our tea." Children played in rubble, mothers lined up for rations, clerks opened shops, all knowing a rocket might obliterate them in silence. The city had survived the Blitz, but the Blitz at least gave warning. The V2 offered none. For the Allies, the effect was sobering. Winston Churchill called the rockets the most cruel weapons ever devised, confessing to his cabinet that they could not be stopped. Fighter squadrons could chase Von second, but not V2 seconds. Anti-aircraft gunners were powerless. For the first time, the defenders of London were utterly helpless. And yet, the miracle never came. The rockets were terrible, yes, but not decisive. Britain did not sue for peace. Antwerp did not collapse as a supply hub. Instead, Allied engineers developed deception campaigns, feeding German launch crews false weather data to throw off aim. Bombers scoured northern France and Holland for mobile launch sites. Meanwhile, Allied armies pressed forward relentlessly, overrunning launch areas and forcing the Germans to retreat. For Hitler, the V-weapons became both propaganda and obsession. He boasted that they would bring England to her knees, yet even as he spoke, the Reich shrank mile by mile. The rockets gave Germany one last ability to strike, but they could not change the fact that Allied bombers burned German cities nightly, and Soviet armies closed in from the east. In the end, the Von second and V2 seconds were not war winners. They were war prolongers, terrifying civilians, stalling morale, but never shifting the battlefield. They left instead a legacy of shattered families, haunted cities, and the chilling knowledge that in the future, no one would ever be safe from weapons that struck without warning. The Führer's last illusion. By late 1944, Adolf Hitler was a man besieged by reality yet insulated by fantasy. Reports from the front were grim Soviets pushing through Poland, Americans and British breaking across France. Fuel was gone, divisions shattered, cities burning. And still, in the map rooms of the Wolf's Lair and later in the Berlin bunker, Hitler returned again and again to a single refrain. The Wunderwaffe would turn the tide. He bullied his generals with promises. "Just wait until the new weapons arrive," he told them. To Albert Speer, his armaments minister, he confided that the Allies' industrial advantage could be nullified by German genius. At conferences, he pointed at blueprints of the Me-262, the V2, the Amerika bomber, insisting these machines would restore initiative. He dismissed doubts as cowardice or sabotage. Some generals humored him, others despaired. Heinz Guderian, the famed tank commander, called the Maus tank a monstrosity, but Hitler brushed him aside. Luftwaffe officers pleaded to deploy the Me-262 as a fighter. only to watch Hitler insist on using it as a bomber. When production delays mounted, he lashed out, blaming treachery or lack of will. In truth, the Reich no longer had the fuel, materials, or time. The irony was brutal. Hitler's fixation on miracle weapons only accelerated Germany's collapse. Resources that might have gone into proven weapons, flak guns, fighter aircraft, armored vehicles were diverted into prototypes that never reached mass deployment. Factories turned out jets that could not be fueled, rockets that terrorized but could not win, blueprints that would never leave the drawing board. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence intercepted his speeches and noted the desperation. To them, the Wunderwaffe talk was both alarming and pathetic, a dictator clinging to toys while his empire crumbled. Yet the Allies did not dismiss the threat entirely. American generals fretted about jets slashing through bomber formations. British ministers dreaded rockets falling on London. The fear was real, but so too was the recognition that Hitler was gambling everything on weapons he could not truly wield. Inside Germany, propaganda echoed his delusions. Goebbels promised that secret weapons would punish the enemy. Posters showed sleek silhouettes rising into the sky. Ordinary Germans whispered rumors of death rays, supertanks, or bombs that could sink entire fleets. In their kitchens and shelters, citizens clung to the hope that science would save them, because nothing else could. But by early 1945, the truth was unmistakable. The Wunderwaffe had not reversed defeat, they had only delayed the inevitable. Hitler, increasingly isolated in his bunker, still spoke of miracle weapons in staff meetings, but his words rang hollow. The generals knew. The weapons had not saved Stalingrad, had not stopped D-Day, had not broken London. The miracles were illusions, and the illusions were killing Germany. The cost of chasing miracles. By the winter of 1944-45, the balance sheet of Germany's miracle weapons was stark. On one side, flashes of brilliance, the Me-260, the world's first operational jet fighter, the V-2, the first ballistic missile, the Maus and Dora, monuments to engineering audacity. On the other, the price, a drained treasury, crippled supply lines, and an army bled of resources it desperately needed. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was a shell of its former self. Factories devoted to jet production churned out airframes faster than engines could be built, leaving rows of incomplete Me-262 seconds stranded. Training squadrons lacked fuel, so new pilots went into combat with barely a handful of flight hours. Meanwhile, the Allies produced thousands of conventional fighters every month, flooding the skies with Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Tempests. The V-1 and V-2 campaigns consumed staggering amounts of manpower and material. Each rocket required precision components, rare alloys, and massive labor. Thousands of prisoners perished at Mittelwerk to keep the program alive. And for what? The rockets killed civilians but never slowed Allied offensives. The Rhine was crossed, the Ruhr encircled, Berlin approached, all while Hitler boasted of vengeance weapons. Armor production fared no better. Dreams of super-heavy tanks like the Maus diverted engineers and steel away from proven designs. The reliable Panzer IV and Panther, which might have been produced in greater numbers, were sidelined for prototypes too massive to maneuver in real combat. By contrast, the Soviets rolled out tens of thousands of T-34 seconds, flooding the Eastern Front with rugged machines that overwhelmed German defenses. Strategically, the Wunderwaffe acted like a black hole, sucking in resources with little return. Albert Speer later admitted that Germany squandered its last reserves of steel, fuel, and labor on weapons that impressed more than they achieved. Had those resources been poured into anti-aircraft defenses, or U-boats, or conventional fighters, the war might still have ended in defeat, but perhaps months later, perhaps at far greater Allied cost. Instead, the obsession with miracles accelerated collapse. Cities burned under relentless Allied bombing. The Wehrmacht retreated on every front. Supply convoys ran dry, leaving divisions without ammunition or fuel. By January 1945, German soldiers were fighting with horse-drawn wagons and scavenged weapons, while in Peenemünde and Mittelwerk, engineers polished prototypes that no longer mattered. The irony was merciless. Hitler had promised salvation through technology, but his Wunderwaffe became symbols of futility. Each rocket launched, each jet sortie, each colossal machine rolled out of a factory brought Germany nothing but another day of war, and each day brought the Reich closer to annihilation. The miracle weapons had not saved Germany. they had drained it. Symbols in ashes. April 1945. Berlin was a city of rubble, its streets echoing with artillery and the tramp of Soviet boots. Yet in the midst of collapse, rumors still flickered that miracle weapons were hidden in secret vaults, that jets and rockets would rise to scatter the enemy. Even as shells fell on the Reich Chancellery, Hitler clung to those illusions, demanding reports on weapons that no longer existed. But outside the bunker, the contrast was brutal. London still stood, bruised but unbroken, despite months of Von Second and V2 seconds. Antwerp remained a supply hub, feeding Allied armies that pressed deeper into Germany. On the Eastern Front, Soviet tank brigades rolled forward in endless waves, indifferent to tales of superweapons. The Reich had promised storms of fire. The reality was ash and silence. The most haunting image came not from the battlefield, but from the tunnels of Mittelwerk. When US troops entered in April 1945, they found half-assembled rockets lined up like steel giants in the dark. Alongside them lay the bodies of prisoners who had built them, starved, broken, discarded. The contrast was unbearable. Machines that pointed to the future, surrounded by the corpses of the present. One American officer wrote simply, "We walked through hell and found the rockets of tomorrow." Elsewhere, Allied soldiers stumbled upon the hulks of abandoned mouse tanks, prototypes too heavy to move, sitting like stranded beasts. Blueprints for Amerika Bombers and jet bombers were stuffed into filing cabinets, their paper edges curling in the damp. The Wunderwaffe still looked impressive in sketches, but in reality, they were relics of a regime that mistook spectacle for salvation. And yet, the symbolic power endured. German civilians whispered that the rockets had been too few, too late, as though numbers alone could have changed fate. Allied troops, too, marveled at the technology, realizing they were glimpsing weapons decades ahead of their time. The contradiction became the final irony of the Third Reich, that its most advanced creations would outlive the Reich itself, serving new masters in a new world. In the smoking ruins of Berlin, Hitler's faith in miracle weapons died with him. But the symbols remained. Sleek jets on airfields, rockets pointing skyward, tanks that looked like fortresses. They were not miracles, they were monuments to arrogance, desperation, and the tragic belief that machines alone could decide history. The legacy of miracles that failed. The war ended not with miracle weapons, but with attrition, industry, and overwhelming force. By May 1945, Berlin was a shell, Hitler was dead, and the Third Reich lay in ruins. Yet the shadow of the Wunderwaffe lingered long after the last shot was fired, leaving questions that historians and survivors have asked ever since. How close had Germany come to reshaping the war with technology? Could things have been different if only the weapons had arrived sooner, in greater numbers? The answer is as complex as the weapons themselves. In one sense, the Wunderwaffe were astonishing achievements. The Me-262 showed the dawn of the jet age. The V2 was the ancestor of intercontinental missiles and space rockets. Even the more fantastical designs, the Horten flying wing, the Amerika Bomber, the colossal tanks hinted at possibilities that would shape the Cold War imagination. Seen in isolation, they were machines of genius, evidence that German engineering had leapt decades ahead of its time. But war is not fought in isolation. It is fought in factories, on farms, in the fuel depots and the rail lines, in the bellies of soldiers and the nerves of civilians. Here, the Wunderwaffe failed utterly. Each rocket cost resources Germany could no longer spare. Each jet required alloys and fuel that the Reich lacked. Each supertank diverted steel from weapons that could actually fight. The supposed miracles only deepened the shortages, hastening collapse. The Allied strategy of total war, mobilizing entire economies, sustaining mass production, overwhelming with numbers, proved the true miracle of the conflict. American assembly lines delivered 96,000 planes in 1944 alone. Soviet factories, even while under siege, turned out 40,000 tanks. Britain produced radar, codebreakers, and aircraft in quantities Germany could not match. Against such a tide, no handful of prototype weapons could prevail. Yet the allure of the Wunderwaffe was not just technical, it was psychological. For Hitler, they were symbols of control in a world slipping from his grasp. For German civilians, they were promises that defeat was not inevitable. For Allied leaders, they were reminders that complacency could be fatal. that the enemy still had surprises left. The weapons fed hope, fear, and propaganda. They did not change the war, but they changed how the war was felt. The moral cost was deeper still. In the tunnels of Mittelwerk, tens of thousands of forced laborers perished building V-2 rockets. At Dora, engineers drafted blueprints while prisoners died within earshot, stacked like refuse along the walls. For every rocket that struck London, more lives were extinguished in its making. The legacy of the Wunderwaffe is not only about technology but about complicity, how brilliance can coexist with brutality, how dreams of the future can be built on the bones of the present. And then came the aftermath. When the Reich collapsed, the Allies scrambled not only for territory but for knowledge. The Americans launched Operation Paperclip, capturing Wernher von Braun and dozens of rocket scientists who had once served Hitler. Within a decade, those same men were testing missiles for the US Army. Within 2 decades, their Saturn V would carry astronauts to the moon. The Soviets, too, seized engineers and hardware, laying the foundations of their missile arsenal. The space race of the Cold War was, in many ways, the final echo of Hitler's Wunderwaffe. There is a haunting irony in that. The rockets that terrorized London became the vehicles that lifted mankind beyond Earth. The jet fighters that harassed Allied bombers became the prototypes for modern air forces. Even the bizarre designs that never flew flying wings, intercontinental bombers, shaped the imagination of military planners for generations. The Reich, that had sought salvation through miracle weapons, perished, but its technology outlived it, repurposed by the very enemies it had sought to destroy. So what do we learn from this history? One lesson is that technology alone does not win wars. A weapon, no matter how advanced, is only as strong as the strategy, resources, and people who wield it. Another lesson is darker, that the pursuit of miracles can blind leaders to reality, seducing them with fantasies while the world collapses around them. Hitler's faith in the Wunderwaffe was not just misplaced, it was catastrophic, draining Germany's last reserves for machines that offered spectacle without salvation. And yet, the story still compels us because of the tantalizing what if. What if the Me-260 had flown in squadron strength in 1943? What if the V-2 had been mass-produced earlier? Could the Normandy invasion have failed? Could the bomber offensive have faltered? These questions will never be fully answered, but most historians agree. Even then, the outcome was unlikely to change. The Allies' economic might was too vast, their manpower too deep, their industrial momentum unstoppable. Germany could delay defeat, but not escape it. In the ruins of Berlin, as Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag, the final verdict was clear. Miracle weapons could terrify, impress, even kill, but they could not save a doomed strategy. The true wonder of the war was not in a rocket or a jet, but in the relentless mobilization of entire societies, in the resilience of people under fire, in the grinding arithmetic of production and supply. The Wunderwaffe remain, in memory, both fascinating and tragic, glimpses of a future born in the service of a collapsing empire. They are reminders that technology is never neutral, that it carries the weight of the hands that build it, the regimes that direct it, and the lives consumed in its making. As Allied troops walked through the tunnels of Mittelwerk, past rows of unfinished rockets, one soldier scrawled on the wall with chalk, "No more miracles." It was both a judgment and a prophecy. The age of miracles was over. What remained was history, a history that warns us still.